Paul's letter to the Galatians is older than Acts, but Acts begins the story of the Holy Spirit at the earliest point possible, the day of Pentecost. Galatians has the advantage of being a first-hand account, in addition to belonging to Paul's undisputed letters. Luke Acts, as we know, is a second-hand account, acknowledged to be that by the author, who claimed support from quality sources presumed to be first-hand witnesses. The story in Acts on day one of the Holy Spirit, as it were, begins like this, and we heard this last night too from Benna's presidential address. When the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place, and suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues as of fire appeared among them, and a tongue rested on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages, as the Spirit gave them ability. An event that includes a sound like the rush of a violent wind, tongues of fire, and a sudden outburst of speech in a variety of languages has at least the connotation of a commotion. It is not business as usual. It is not an ordinary day at the office. The choreography suggests a new era. The sound is loud enough to attract the attention of the neighborhood. As people gather, what strikes the ones arriving first is speech. And at this sound the crowd gathered and was bewildered, because each one heard them speaking in the native language of each. Amazed and astonished, they asked, "Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear, each of us, in our own native language?" Parthians, Medes, Elamites, and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt, and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs, in our own languages we hear them speaking about God's deeds of power. In the eyes of these observers, there is noise and commotion, but it is not disorderly. If the event suggests novelty, as it seems to do, it could also be seen as a reversal that goes all the way back to Genesis, to the time when the whole earth had one language and the same words. We know what happened next: the aspiration to build a tower, to make a name for themselves, and to prevent being scattered, in Genesis 11. And the Lord said, "Look, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language there, so that they will not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Where is the reversal? It is seen in the confusion of languages in Genesis and the intelligibility of speech in Acts. Language is the building block of community, and the tower builders cannot have one. At Pentecost, the prospect for building human community is restored. The scattering of people in Genesis is reversed by the gathering of people in Acts. The New Age feel of the story in Acts has an apocalyptic character, a sense that the end is near. Lucid and effective communication is in this view the tool of mission, to make the Holy Spirit the agent and enabler of mission. On the one hand, we read that all were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" Others thought they knew the answer. The narrator says that others sneered and said they are filled with new wine, or they are drunk. Where some heard noise but saw order, others heard noise and saw disorder. Let's see. Where some perceived clarity, others reported confusion. The suspicion of anarchy, chaos, and drunkenness was credible enough to make Peter issue a corrective. These are not drunk as you suppose, for it is only 9 o'clock in the morning. To Peter, the precedent-breaking event had an antecedent in prophecy. They are not drunk. No, this is what was spoken through the prophet Joel. These others, as noted, more kindly disposed and more curious, did not perceive anarchy, but they did sense that a new kind of order had broken into the world. A witnessing community arising outside established chain of command structures. The identity of the communicating voice in the new era was less important than the content and comprehensibility of the message. The trajectory and tenor of the new age continue in Peter's vision of the rooftop, and the subsequent contact with Cornelius, a Gentile. It is evident that the inclusion of the Gentiles faced a hurdle not only of division, but also of disgust, a visceral antipathy against inclusion. We can deduce no less by the drastic pedagogy used, the array of unclean and disgusting animals Peter was instructed to kill and eat. Peter obeys the summons, going to Cornelius' house with a new script in place, a vision of inclusion. While Peter was still speaking, the Holy Spirit fell upon all who heard the word. We read, Acts 10:44. The fire of Pentecost is breaking out among the Gentiles, above and beyond human orchestration. While we cannot call the situation anarchy, we must call it a radically new order. The element now escaping human and institutional control is experience. The validity of the new order is authenticated by Gentiles having the same experience as the Jews. The circumcised believers who had come to Peter were astounded that the gift of the Holy Spirit had been poured out even on the Gentiles, for they heard them speaking in tongues and extolling God. This leads to Peter's comment, a concession to the obligation to accept experiential evidence. Can anyone withhold the water for baptizing these people who have received the Holy Spirit just as we have? The story continues in Acts at the Jerusalem Council. It now includes the who is who in the expanding community of believers such as Peter, Paul, and James, and it has the shape of a body structured so as to serve as the template for authoritative decision-making in the believing community and later in the Christian church. Again, experience carries weight to the point that it appears to settle the matter. And God, who knows the human heart, testified to them by giving them the Holy Spirit, just as he did to us. And in cleansing their hearts by faith, he has made no distinction between them and us. Acts 15. Experience is not anarchy, but experience can be a challenge to tradition and established structures of authority that are not attuned to that experience and did not anticipate it. The new and stabilizing authority structure in Acts seems to be undercut by Paul and his memory of the Jerusalem Council in Galatians, and this is getting to my point. Galatians, as noted, is a first-hand account, undisputedly written by Paul, with Paul himself a participant to the proceedings. In the version we have in Acts, the dispute seems to be resolved with a speech by James, possibly Jesus' half-brother. Paul's recollection in Galatians strikes a different tone. First, by staking out room for himself that stands pointedly apart from Peter, James, and the Jerusalem elders. And second, by disparaging their pretension to play an authoritative role. We might adjudicate the difference between Acts and Galatians by appealing to the priority of apostolic authority, Paul, over institutional authority, the Jerusalem Council. This will not get us off the hook, however. While Paul seems to disparage the Jerusalem Council, he does not denigrate experience. The collegial tone in Acts is missing in Galatians. Whether we compare it to the council held in Acts 11, with Peter in the lead role, or the one held in Acts 15, with James as the definitive voice. Consensus is missing too, as is the notion of an authoritative body that has the final word. In Galatians, Paul gives a biographical outline that is structured to create distance between him and the Jerusalem Council and its chain of command tenor. Don't be shy to stop me when my time is up, because who knows, I'm not looking at my watch right now. J. Lew Martin has perceptively summarized how Paul carves out space apart from the council operations and a claim to superior authority. Listen to this. The gospel I preach is not what human beings normally have in mind, verse 11, 1:11. Not what human beings normally have in mind when they speak of good news. I did not receive it from another human being. I was not taught it. I did not ask advice from anyone. I did not make a trip to Jerusalem. On the contrary, I went away to Arabia. I returned to Damascus, traveling there directly, that is to say, not passing through Jerusalem. After 3 years had passed, I did go up to Jerusalem, but aside from Cephas, I did not see any of the other apostles except James. What I'm writing to you is not a lie. Then I went to the region of Syria and Cilicia, far from Jerusalem. Thus, through the whole of this period, the Christians in the churches of Judea did not even know me by sight. They had only heard stories about me. Paul continues this line of thought in the next chapter, not only to drive home the legitimacy of his Gentile mission, but also by showing lines of division that do not exist in Acts. The storyline of the Gentile mission differs too, as do the council minutes. My brothers, you know that in the early days God made a choice among you that I should be the one whom the Gentiles would hear the message, through whom the Gentiles would hear the message of the good news and become believers. Peter says, with an evident sense of calling and authority in Acts. Paul tells the story differently. On the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel for the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel for the circumcised, you know the rest. They gave to Barnabas and to me the right hand of fellowship, agreeing that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel for the circumcised. While the council minutes differ as noted, Paul initially claimed to have the backing of the council. The Gentile mission belonged to him. This is the point where harmony gives way to conflict, and where the independence of Paul's experience in Galatians 1 widens into direct opposition. Indeed, where Peter is the courageous boundary-crossing pioneer in Acts, he is in Galatians a timid conformist. Paul traces the line of influence to Jerusalem, saying of Peter that until certain people came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. James, we know, was the lead voice in Acts, and is also mentioned in Galatians in connection with Paul's recollection of the council. So, I made this short, but even short paper was too long for our allotted time here. So let me just, because you know these stories so well that I don't need to belabor the point. So Paul stakes out space in a direct line through the Spirit working in his life over against a kind of chain of command structure that is kind of in the making in the book of Acts. So the Holy Spirit operates in the world in the Pauline conception, not through these bodies that make conclusions like they did in Acts, and they say, oh, we have decided this is how it should be. When Paul remembers that thing, he says, well, really great people, but how great they were doesn't matter to me. God has made, he kind of is disparaging, and he puts distance between himself and them. And he does it, yes, you could say, well, he had apostolic authority. You cannot do apostolic authority in the 1st century. You can do that in the 3rd and 5th and 10th century. But in the 1st century, your authority will only be the authority of your experience, the authenticity of that. And all of Galatians is actually an appeal, not just the experience of the Apostle Paul, but also the experience of the Galatian believers, who at the point of when Paul argues for his case in Galatians, he draws his strongest argument from the experience of the Galatian believers, who, when they were baptized, went under and came up again and shouted, Abba, Father. And that is Paul's maybe clinching argument against the counter-missionaries that are at work. So, my paper is available, I think, on our website. I haven't completely finished that latter part of the argument, but I leave the rest to you and the paper and you, and then the primacy, risky as it seems, of experience in the age of the Spirit.